I'd like to start then, tonight by just reading Job 27. I'm going to read it in ESV. The only comment I'll make is just right at the beginning, and we're just going to read straight through. The comment I want to make is that the first verse says, it points out that this is a new discourse. So Job finished chapter 26, which is response to Bildad. Now he's starting again another discourse. And Job again took up his discourse and said, "As God lives, who has taken away my right, and the Almighty who has made my soul bitter. As long as my breath is in me and the Spirit of God is in my nostrils, my lips will not speak falsehood, and my tongue will not utter deceit. Far be it from me to say that you are right. Till I die, I will not put away my integrity from me. I hold fast my righteousness and will not let it go. My heart does not reproach me for any of my days. Let my enemy be as the wicked, and let him who rises up against me be as the unrighteous. For what is the hope of the godless when God cuts him off, when God takes away his life? Will God hear his cry when distress comes upon him? Will he take delight in the Almighty? Will he call upon God at all times? I will teach you concerning the hand of God. What is with the Almighty I will not conceal. Behold, all of you have seen it yourselves. Why then have you become altogether vain? This is the portion of a wicked man with God, and the heritage that oppressors receive from the Almighty. If his children are multiplied, it is for the sword, and his descendants have not enough bread. Those who survive him, the pestilence buries, and his widows do not weep. Though he heap up silver like dust and pile up clothing like clay, he may pile it up, but the righteous will wear it, and the innocent will divide the silver. He builds his house like a moth's, like a booth that a watchman makes. He goes to bed rich, but will do so no more. He opens his eyes, and his wealth is gone. Terrors overtake him like a flood. In the night, a whirlwind carries him off. The east wind lifts him up, and he is gone. It sweeps him out of his place. It hurls at him without pity. He flees from its power in headlong flight. It clasps its hands at him and hisses at him from its place." It's Job 27. Did anybody read it? Read this like earlier this week or maybe today? This is the first time you're encountering it in a while. Catherine read it.
Yes, I did.
Anybody else? Okay, so it's a very important chapter, and I think it's very interesting. It's interesting to me because I think that when we read it the first time and maybe the second and third time, we don't get what's happening. We read the first 6 verses and we read it and we say Job is making an oath. He's taking an oath, swearing by God's authority, God's name, that Job will not deny his integrity, that he's holding fast, right? And then he brings down, he curses his enemies. He brings an imprecatory word against them in verse 7. And then he says to his friends that he's going to describe to them God's dealings with the wicked and that they should know this, but they've just been saying vain things. And then he goes on and describes God's dealings with the wicked. And, and that takes up the rest of the chapter. And yeah, my mom's shaking her head. She's going, "There's something wrong with that." What do you think, Mom?
I'm thinking he's describing in a lot of this what has happened to him, and yet he's saying he's not wicked.
Right. He is describing things. And, we noted that before. God's covenant curses appear to have come upon Job. And so when he describes the wicked, he is in a lot of ways describing his own experience, the experience of the wicked. So there's a couple of different ways that people have interpreted this passage, and I'll get to my understanding in just a minute. But the first way is that I read one commentator who said Job is in this entire chapter, when he makes his oath based on his righteousness, based on his integrity, that he's not going to deny his integrity, that this is the way a godly man should respond to his accusers. and that Job is holding on to his faith in God here, and he's completely without any kind of blame. And then he goes on and describes the fate of the wicked, and it's different in some way to the way that his friends had described it. But it's that first part, Job is saying something that every believer should say in the face of difficulty to their accusers. And I don't think that's right. I think what Job is doing is, there's another group of interpreters who follow the second way, which usually when I do my study, I don't read the comments of other interpreters until I've actually worked through the passage and come up with my own understanding of the passage, and then I go in and look at the interpreters. So what's happening is, this is the way people usually read it. If you start reading from verse 2, as God lives, and then you skip down to verse 3. As God lives, as long as my breath is in me and the Spirit of God is in my nostrils, my lips will not speak falsehood, etc. But actually what Job says is, as God lives, and then he says two things about God, who has taken away my right, and the Almighty who has made my soul bitter. As long as my breath is in me and the Spirit of God is in my nostrils. He says, as a matter of, it's not an accusation, he's just saying, it's as a matter of fact, God has denied my rights. God is unrighteous. If Job has rights and God has denied them, then Job is saying God is unrighteous. And then he goes on and says, 3 through 6, as long as my breath is in me and the Spirit of God is in my nostrils, my lips will not speak falsehood and my tongue will not utter deceit. Far be it from me to say you are right, meaning his friends. The you is plural there. You are right. Till I die, I will not put away my integrity from me. I will fast my righteousness and will not let it go. Now, his righteousness here is he's still basically arguing the same argument that's been going on through the book. And that argument is, what is the cause of Job's suffering? And he is still maintaining, and he is right to do so, that he is completely innocent. He didn't do anything that caused that. But now it's months later, right? He's still arguing that same point. And so when he says his righteousness, he's not saying his behavior, throughout the course of his whole life. He's not saying I never sinned. He's saying I have a righteous case. I hold fast to my righteousness and will not let it go. My heart does not reproach me for any of my days. And so then he's brought in everything, and not just that one instance, but now he says, that's just been the way I've been my whole life. And so he does get to that point. And what he ends up doing is, even though he swears an oath by God, his hope is not in God. His hope is in the rightness of his case. And so he is not arguing he's not doing what the first set of commentators think he's doing. He's actually saying, God has denied me things that are rightfully mine. Therefore, God is unrighteous. That would be the only conclusion. God is unjust. And I will be able to be proved right because of my own integrity. That's the end. That's the basic feeling there. So I want to support that by a couple of things. The first thing I want to look at, and I know I have the outline, a couple of different passages, but I want to actually, before we go to those, I want to look at Job 32. This is where Elihu is first introduced. So, Job 32. So when Elihu is introduced, the narrator is speaking here in the first bit of chapter 32. So the narrator, we've heard him at the beginning. He introduced Job and the setting and all of that. We hear him at the end. He talks about Job and God and three friends. And when he said at the beginning that Job is a righteous man, we believed him. And he says it at the end, and we believe him. And we should. And that's the way the book is set out. So now here's the narrator speaking again. So these three men ceased to answer Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. That is a terrible characterization, right? I mean, it's true, but it would be terrible to have that said of anybody, that they were righteous in their own eyes. But the narrator says here, not that these three men thought that Job was righteous in his own eyes, but that Job was in fact righteous in his own eyes. Then Elihu, the son of Berachel, the Buzite of the family of Ram, burned with anger. He burned with anger at Job because he justified himself rather than God. Again, the narrator's words. He burned with anger also at Job's three friends because they had found no answer, although they had declared Job to be in the wrong. Now Elihu had waited to speak to Job because they were older than he, and when Elihu saw that there was no answer in the mouth of these three men, he burned with anger. So we read this, and we think this is just an introduction to Elihu, but it's actually a condemnation of Job. It is an explanation for why Elihu is actually even necessary to speak here, because Job's been throughout the book asking for an audience with God, and by the time his friends finish speaking and then Job responds, his heart progressively gets into the wrong place. If the book ends, with chapter 25 and chapter 26, Job's still okay, but in chapter 27, he takes a turn. And from 27 through 31, he's going to start saying things which are going to build the case that he is righteous in his own eyes. And you can see it already in what we looked at in the first 6 verses of chapter 27. And so Elihu is absolutely a necessary addition, because Elihu's function is to prepare Job to meet God. Job's not ready. So I guess I want to say this also at this point. The interpretation that I'm giving of chapter 27 dovetails perfectly with the interpretation I just gave of the first part here of chapter 32 and the position of Elihu. Surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, in the history of interpretation among conservative evangelical scholars, there have been 2 ways Elihu is viewed. One way is the way I just described. He's like a John the Baptist type figure preparing Job. The other way is that Elihu is just like the 3 friends. He just says the same thing the 3 friends said. And on that view, this Job is righteous in his own eyes is attributed to Elihu thinks he's righteous in his own eyes. But I think to be consistent with the way we understand the words of the narrator, we can't take it like that. We have to read the words of the narrator as telling us the situation. So I understand 27 as Job tipping his hand, basically saying, it's my righteousness that my hope is in, which makes it, if we go back to chapter 27, when Job says at the beginning, 1 through 6, basically, that my hope is in my integrity. My hope is in myself. That's basically what he's saying. Then this makes 7 through the rest of the chapter almost surreal. It's because in verse 8, he's going to talk about the wicked in verse 7. He's going to say, the wicked are like this. And, verse 8, what is the hope of the godless when God cuts him off? So he's just said, my hope is in my righteousness. What is the hope of the godless when God cuts him off, when God takes away his life? Will God hear his cry when distress comes upon him? Will he take delight in the Almighty? Will he call upon God at all times? The godless man is the person who does not hope in God. Job has just said, I hope in myself. And then he's called down the curse on people who don't hold their hope in God. And so by giving this description, he condemns himself. His words condemn himself. And I think that's the tragic thing that's going on in chapter 27 is that Job is so focused on the one incident of, my lifestyle did not cause this suffering, that he has made that almost into an idol. That now, he's just basically fixated on that one thing. Does that make sense? Or does that actually not make sense? But is that the way you read the text? Does that see like the
Yes, I believe you referred to that also in our last class in Job, where you said to us in chapters 29 to 31 that it seems as though this is Job's final defense. His integrity is almost an idol.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you could see it coming. And of course, we've all read ahead, I think. And if we've seen progression, it's, you go, okay, well, it's going to get to here. And then you can see the signs of it. Chapter 27 is, in my opinion, very clear what Job is doing. Anybody else have any thoughts about that? Okay.
Just, do you think that Job has any recognition that that's what he's doing?
No. I think that's why Elihu is.
I don't either, because that's why he goes on to talk about the wicked man and how God's going to treat him. And he's not even thinking that he's describing himself.
Yeah. He's, and so, it's kind of it's a surreal chapter, like I said. As soon as you realize what's happening in verses 1 through 6, and then you start reading on, you go, oh man, this is it's got an ominous tone. He starts describing the wicked, and it's like, man, you're talking about yourself. Watch out. So, and I wonder, I was trying to think, how often do we do things like that, right? Misplace our confidence and then criticize others for misplacing their confidence and separating ourselves from them.
Well, the other thing that's interesting to me is that as this conversation with his three friends has gone on, he has now gotten to the place where he's kind of adopted their worldview. Yeah,
we're going to see a little bit later in the outline, earlier, chapter 4, Eliphaz had said to him, you should let your righteousness, let your integrity be the ground upon which you stand in your argument. And Job had rejected it. But that's what he's doing here. So he has started to adopt. He rejected it apparently verbally, but there was something that was attractive, and so it gets into his thinking, and now it's coming out. And there's bad teaching is like a time bomb, right? If you don't hold it up to the light and expose it and say, I reject that, it will bear fruit later. And so we all need to be really careful about what we accept or what we don't fight against. That's where the error usually happens. People think, oh, it's not that bad, or it sounds almost right. Something that sounds almost right is just wrong. That's what almost right is. It's wrong. So integrity has been, I think we'll go to my outline now. Integrity has been a main theme in the book. We looked at it before. I'm just going to run through some passages real quick. It's brought up in the beginning. It's used, a synonym is used, blameless, right? Chapter 1, verse 1, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. So he's blameless and upright. He's a man of integrity. Chapter 1, verse 8, and the Lord said to Satan. So that first voice is the narrator. Now we have the Lord saying these words, have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. It's describing a man with a consistent character, right? And that's what integrity is. Chapter 2, verse 3, the Lord says again to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. He still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without reason. Now, when God says Job's holding fast his integrity, he's not saying that Job is counting on his integrity to give him righteousness before God or hearing before God. He's saying that his integrity consists in Job's living righteously before God. And to live righteously before God is to live in the way God has called you to live. So Job consistently does that. His highest priority is trying to live righteously before God. But in chapter 27, he says about God that God is treating him unfairly, and that he's going to, it's his integrity, meaning his rightness of his case, not the imputed righteousness that he has by God working in his life. You know, he's now, the righteousness of my case will make me be able to stand on that day and face God, who is treating me wrongly. That kind of thing. Chapter 2, verse 9, his wife said, do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die. This is basically a major theme in the book. Is Job going to hold on to his integrity? Job 27:5, we read that. Far be it from me to say that you are right. Till I die, I will not put away my integrity from me. This is the answer to his wife and to his friends. Job 31:6. Very last chapter before Job is silent and Elihu begins speaking. Let me be weighed in a just balance and let God know my integrity. So, you know, it's brought up a lot, several places, and there's kind of a transition in what's being meant by his integrity. 27 is kind of turns a corner. We also have attacks on Job's integrity throughout the book. We already read Job chapter 1, verse 11. Satan says, stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. So Job's integrity is tied to his unwillingness to make God the enemy. In chapter 1. It says, take everything away from God. God, you take away everything from him. Let me strike him. I'll take away everything that's really, it's you that he's going to turn to. And when he turns to you, he's going to curse you. He's going to say you've done something wrong. In chapter 27, this is where Job ends up. It's just ironic, isn't it? He gets through the suffering, he's getting through the silence, and he gets through his friends, and then he caves in.
I think it's ironic in that he starts out having integrity, but as soon as he begins to trust in his own integrity, he loses it.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The virtues are like that, right? It's a funny thing about humility. As soon as you know you're being humble, you're no longer humble, right? It's a funny thing about pride. When you're being proud, you should be ashamed. It's that type of thing, right? Yeah. Here's the verse in Eliphaz Job 4:6, is not your fear of God your confidence in the integrity of your ways your hope? Well, yeah, maybe those two things together might be, but Job's fear of God is kind of tossed out the window in 27. He's started to move away from it, and but he's hoping in the integrity of his ways.
Yeah, excuse me, Chuck.
Yeah, Catherine.
I'm not sure. I'm sure you'll clear me up, but I'm responding to chapter 26, which in our last class, a lot of us, or some of us, responded with when we were reading it or had read it, that, wow, all of a sudden, this is clear. This is just clear. There's no consternation. There's no rebuking and complaining and all the stuff we've been listening or reading about. It's like, wow, this is refreshing. It was so clear, and on we go. Okay, and so now we get to chapter 27, and bang, there's a complete flip. Now, that is such a sharp contrast for me when I'm reading it that I find it difficult to, and maybe I shouldn't even do it. Maybe I shouldn't compare 26 and 27, but what I'm doing is I'm reading forward, of course, which is probably not a good idea altogether, because then it frames my thinking about where I should be. So I'm trying to figure out what happened in 26, 26 I got, but now because 27 is so vastly, golly, where'd all this come from all of a sudden? Is it because he doesn't have to listen to his other two friends anymore? Does he feel like he's finally free to really show his true, whatever, his true feelings might be a weak word to use, but I don't know what happened. How did that flip so much, Chuck?
Yeah, so I think what's going on, I think we've all experienced it. I think of maybe trying to resist temptation over a long time. So Job's maybe tempted to blame God and accuse God of wrong, and he's been really good at not doing that. He's come pretty close a couple of times, but he doesn't want to give his friends. Well, he wants to maintain his right standing with God. I don't want to give him base motives. He's got good motives, but he also doesn't want to give his friends any firepower. So if he outright comes out and says something against God, that's going to give them firepower. And so this is I don't want to make it sound like he was always wanting to say these things and he was just being quiet because his friends were there. I don't want to say that. But what I do want to say is that because he was under pressure from his friends to respond to his friends, and all of his responses are going to be critiqued by them, he is more guarded with his friends. And it's very stressful, right? Really tiring for him to be doing this thing. And then now his friends have stopped talking.
Right.
And then Zophar just is like, I'm done. I'm not saying anything. Right? The third cycle of speeches, not even the third guy will speak. And so Job finishes chapter 26, where he pretty much realizes that there's probably not a response forthcoming. And what happens to him, I think, is what happens to so many of us if we haven't had much experience with understanding the pattern of temptation. The pattern of temptation is you can resist it when you can feel how strong it is. But when it goes away, you go, oh, I'm good. And then you find yourself doing the thing that you were tempted to do.
That makes sense. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's it. That's what it was or is.
So I think I do think it's something like that. There's some psychological, spiritual pattern there that what I don't want to be understood as saying Job always felt like this the whole time. He was really pretending, and now he's bringing out his true colors. I don't want to sound like that.
No,
I think I'm saying
No,
something closer. Yeah, I think it's closer to Job is letting his feelings or thoughts kind of get away from him. He's saying things that he might believe a little tiny bit, but he's making them sound really loud. And
exactly. You described that's very good. That's a very clear, I get it. I get it based on what you've said, because I knew I was sensing something. It was just such a flip. It was like, whoa, well, now it makes sense. According to how you described it, I very clearly understand it now. And there has been a flip.
There has been, yeah. Does anybody else have any insight as to why that?
I think you're right. I think he's worn out and worn down, and the words that are coming out aren't as well thought out or articulate as he has been in the past. And I think if I'd been sitting with my friends and this had been happening to me for months, that I would be more than tempted to have a pity party.
Yeah. It just reminds me of all the times in the Gospels where Jesus said something like, your words, by your words you'll be condemned, right? And James, don't say things that are going to get you into trouble. Put a bridle on your tongue, that kind of thing. Because God's going to speak in chapter 38, and he's going to start with, who is this who darkens my counsel with foolish words without understanding. And he's not talking about Elihu. He's talking about Job. And I think if God started like that, then which he does, there would be no reason why a rational person would want to say anything back, except, oops, I'm really sorry. Which is pretty much what Job does,
Okay. Thank you, Chuck.
Yeah. So in chapter 13, verses 14 to 16, Job says, why should I take my flesh in my teeth and put my life in my hand? He's saying, why is it that I would want to appear before God? Though he slay me, I will hope in him. Yet I will argue my ways to his face. This will be my salvation, that the godless shall not come before him. So he's not using his own integrity as the reason why God should accept him. He's saying God is the reason God will accept him. And then, so we have a kind of a move. And then in 23, just a couple of chapters ago, 23, 8 through 12, Job says, behold, I go forward, but he is not there, and backward, but I do not perceive him. On the left, when he is working, I do not behold him. He turns to the right hand, but I don't see him. But he knows the way that I take. And when he has tried me, I shall come out as gold. My foot has held fast to his steps. I have kept his way and have not turned aside. I have not departed from the commandment of his lips. I have treasured the words of his mouth more than my portion of food. This chapter, Job is saying he has maintained his integrity, but his integrity is defined as keeping God's commandments, believing that what God does is right, hoping in him. But in chapter 27, he separates the fear of the Lord from his personal integrity. And he starts saying things that we should wince at and hope that we've never said and hope that we will never say, right? But I think we probably all have done these things. We like to be dramatic, right? Sometimes we say stuff like this. We go, oh, it's just me being dramatic. I don't think God understands it that way, because it's actually not that. We deceive ourselves when we say it's not really that important. It is important. We don't want to accuse God of wrongdoing. So Job says, verse 2:27, as God lives, who has taken away my right, and the Almighty, who has made my soul bitter. So the Almighty, who has taken away my right, or God, who has taken away my right. So what Job is referring to is God has, in Job's mind, denied Job vindication. Job has been right. He's been arguing that he's been right. He hasn't, and what he's right about specifically is he didn't do anything to cause everything that happened in chapters 1 and 2. And he is right about that. And he's been asking God to vindicate him. Does God have to vindicate Job? What do we think? No, God's under no obligation at all to vindicate Job, right? So if God denies vindication to Job, which is, he's not actually denying it, but let's just go with the words. If God denies vindication to Job, is God in the wrong? No. God is completely within God's rights to do whatever God wants to do. And Job knew that, right? Job 121, the verse from Job everybody knows. The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. That verse basically screams God can do whatever God's going to do, and it's right all the time. And Job knew that. And he said it with heartbreak and tears, but he didn't accuse God of wrongdoing. He just, God is able to, and God will do whatever God has planned to do, even if I don't understand it, even if he hasn't got my permission, and even if I don't like it. And he is totally right to do all those things. But he starts out, the Almighty has taken away my right. God has denied Job vindication. Job thinks that God owes him vindication. Same with God has denied Job his day in court. Job has consistently said, I want a meeting with you, God, and God has been completely silent. And so we ask the questions again. Is God required to answer? No. But Job somehow thinks he's got a fundamental right to be heard, to get a response from God. And it's all these bad thoughts are corrected by the time we get to the end of the book. These are the actual issues that are addressed by Elihu and by God. Job's gone into some wrong thinking that doesn't represent most of his behavior, all of his life, and most of his behavior in the book of Job. But now he's gone on to this wrong thinking. And for Job's sake, God sends a word. He sends Elihu, a prophet, John the Baptist figure, to prepare Job. And then God himself speaks to Job and corrects him and receives him back. So not only does God end up refuting the accusations, like not only in a legal sense, but he actually demonstrates that he's not the type of God that Job has now characterized him to be. Job thinks God has ignored his words, his pleas, his rights. It's an interesting thing because you can say, you can read chapter 27 and you can think, is Job saying, is the problem this? Is the problem really just this? That I'm upset because God has not answered me yet. But that isn't the problem, right? That would not be a problem. It would just be, it wouldn't be a problem on the magnitude of accusing God of wrongdoing. It would be a problem with patience. That's not Job's problem. Job has basically concluded God is in the wrong. And,
Job is
and
the
so what he's,
character.
yeah, he has. So there's a really great book by C.S. Lewis. It's it's a collection of essays. It's called God in the Dock, and Dock, D-O-C-K. The title is an allusion to the British way of doing trials. In a British trial, the prisoner would stand in the dock, and the judge would question and then pass sentence and usually condemn a prisoner. But at least the person in the dock was the one who was being examined for wrongdoing. And in the biblical worldview, in the true way of looking at things, in the Christian's mind, we are in the dock. God is never in the dock. We are the ones who God looks at and examines. And without Jesus, we would be completely condemned and destroyed. And Jesus is in the dock for our sake, but never God, never God. C.S. Lewis said, in the minds of modern men, the roles have reversed. Men are sitting in the judge's seat. God is in the dock. This is what Job has done. Job has said to God, I'm your judge. You're in the wrong. I'm coming now to court to condemn you. I want to hear your arguments why you're not in the wrong. Whereas before, Job wanted to have his day in court with God because he understood that God was not unjust and that God would make it right. Maybe not reverse the situation, but at least he would give Job peace about it. And that it wasn't a thing where somebody was being judged for wrongdoing. It was more like a conversation between people who had maybe, one person understands what's going on, the other person doesn't quite understand, and they're trying to get to an agreement. But now Job has kind of switched it, and now it's full-on courtroom where God is the one that's being summoned to make a defense. So, I already said that the oath he takes, I didn't use these words, but it's very ironic because he says, swears by God that he will hold fast to his own righteousness. I find that really humorous. I don't know if do you see how humorous that is? I'm gonna prove you wrong, and I swear by your own name that I will do it.
Yeah.
He's
It's
confused.
remarkable.
Yeah, go ahead, Catherine. Sorry.
That's okay. The more I go through this, and there's a beginning, chapter 1, of course, and you alluded to chapter 1, verse 22 or 21. And I'm reading through all of this at this point in time. Through all this, Job did not sin, nor did he blame God. And look at what has happened. This is a mighty picture to me. It's how this is strong. I think this is really strong. How much has taken place in his spirit, in his heart, in his behavior, in his love of Christ or of God.
Yeah, it shows that Job, even though he was the most blameless and righteous man of his generation, that he is at the end of the day, he's like everyone else. He is going to sin. He will fall. He is. I mean, it's like, when you look at Adam and Eve and you think, why is it that Adam fell? Right? And it's one of those questions. What happened here with Job? I think that the psychological explanation I gave is probably It's understandable. Probably has something to do with it.
Mhm.
And I think there's a
Mhm.
parallel with Adam, who really wasn't involved in the temptation. You know, he was his temptation was completely different than Eve's. You know, so but yeah, Job he actually needs a redeemer, just like he said.
Mhm.
And and so we shouldn't be surprised that a person demonstrates that they need a redeemer, even after such a long, good track record. Um, people still show themselves to be sinful, and God will restore him. God will restore him, and
Yeah.
because it's this
Yeah.
isn't the end. Yeah, Susan.
Can I please correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm sitting here thinking about everything you're saying, and it makes me, I don't know where the passage is, but it makes me think of the passage that Christ is telling a parable, and he's talking about the people that go out in his name and do all these wonderful works. And he ends up telling them, "Depart from me, for I never knew you." And it makes me think that Job is hanging on to his works, that his works are so righteous that it makes him infallible. So is there a connection there? Am I wrong about that?
I don't think that you're wrong. I think that there is a possibility at this point. Not if you read the story of Job and you don't know the ending, there's a possibility that it could end with total apostasy. But the Lord is going to restrain him and bring him back. Whereas the people in Matthew 7 are self-deceived. They reject the gospel. They want the power. They're like Simon Magus, who wants the power of the Holy Spirit, but he doesn't want the gospel. And they go out and they do works that look like they're Christian works done in the power of Christ, but they're not. In Matthew 7, people, they heal people, they drive out, they prophesy in his name, all those things. Job is in danger of that. I mean, at least as far as, I guess I would say it like this. We know the end of Job's story. So there's no actual, I mean, he is one of God's elect. God is going to preserve him. And that's what happened. But we know that because we know the end of the story. If we didn't know the end of the story and we only had this, we would go, it would be a morality tale. What's going to happen to Job? Don't let that happen to you. Type of thing. So what the book of Job illustrates is that even though one of God's people is the right word, one of God's people that go off the rails, God will restore them. He won't let them go off into self-destruction. It's another prodigal son type of pattern. Yeah. So what we see, if we look at the big meta narrative, the meta picture in Job, we see God's goodness in restoring his servant who has struggled so much, suffered so much, and then said some really foolish things and probably misled some people. God restores him. God's goodness. It doesn't make what Job did any better, but it does tell us that even God will even forgive. He's obviously not looking for perfection. He's looking for repentance. That's what happens. So I want to look at 27, 2 through 6, and read that next to some words of Elihu later on in Job 34. So we've already read 27, but I'll read them again. As God lives, who has taken away my right, and the Almighty, who has made my soul bitter. As long as my breath is in me and the Spirit of God is in my nostrils, my lips will not speak falsehood, and my tongue will not utter deceit. Far be it from me to say that you are right, again, he's talking to his friends there. Far be it from me to say that you are right. Till I die, I will not put away my integrity from me. I will hold fast my righteousness and will not let it go. My heart does not reproach me for any of my days. Elihu says in chapter 34, and again, there's two different ways to look at Elihu. One group of commentators think Elihu is just misrepresenting Job. And another group of commentators think that Elihu's got it right. I think he's got it right. He says, for Job has said, I am in the right, and God has taken away my right. In spite of my right, I am counted a liar. My wound is incurable, though I am without transgression. I think when Elihu says that, he's thinking of these words. And this lines up exactly with what the narrator said. Job justified himself rather than God. Job was righteous in his own eyes. So Elihu is saying what Job, he's accurately summarizing what Job has said, and then he's going to respond to this in what he says. And this is what Job needs. He needs to have these words brought up to him and held up there. And look, Job, you said this. You know, look at your heart. What's wrong with your heart? Repent. And then if you look at Job 33, I'm going to skip over one. Job 33, verse 9. Elihu again, quoting Job. You say, I am pure, without transgression. I am clean. There is no iniquity in me. That really does sound like my heart does not reproach me for any of my days. So, and Job's going to say some things that are similar to this a little bit later, too. But Elihu's got it right, and these are the problems. This going off the rails and accusing God is going to be the thing that God sends Elihu to address. And Elihu is going to do an effective job so that when God shows up, Job is no longer in the God, you have to explain yourself mode. And God really puts him in his place with the first thing God says. But Job is prepared to not be defiant. So just to I have a link there to other places where Job has asserted his blamelessness. And again, in most of these, he's talking about his blamelessness in regard to causing the tragedy. There's 7 or 8 places. We'll just read these real quick. Job 9:21. I am blameless. I regard not myself. I loathe my life. Again, in reference to, I didn't do something to cause this. I'm blameless. He talks to God, although you know that I am not guilty and there is none to deliver out of your hand. I'm not guilty of doing that thing, anything that caused this. One of his friends accused him, you say my doctrine is pure and I am clean in God's eyes. So even way back in Job 11, people were understanding Job to say that, but they were misunderstanding him then. When Elihu says it, he's got it right because Job has said this in chapter 27. Job 12:4, I am a laughingstock to my friends. I who called to God and he answered me, a just and blameless man, am a laughingstock. What Job is starting to do, you can kind of see it in chapter 12, but what he's doing definitely in chapter 27, and I'm sure nobody here has ever been guilty of this, so Job is living in the past. Job is this entire, it was a catastrophic moment, right? Chapters 1 and 2, catastrophic. And it is a defining moment for the book of Job and for Job's life. And he is living in that moment and in what led up to it. And he's just been going over and over and over it. His friends have been going over and over and over it. And this is where he lives. What he has failed to perceive is that time has gone on. and he's also lived some more, and he isn't. It isn't. The question isn't so much about what caused this, and this is not. So when Elihu shows up, Elihu actually changes the debate. He doesn't argue about what caused Job's problems. Elihu doesn't actually care about what caused Job's problems. He says, yeah, but how have you been acting since then? And chapter 27, he's acting terribly. And so he's living in the past. He's stuck there. He's kind of forgot that he has a responsibility to still be faithful and good in all of his words. He kind of acts like in chapter 27 that since he was blameless for the thing that started all of this, then anything he does after that is justified because he was blameless before. Anybody ever do that? Yeah. See, Gary's laughing. Yeah. I think we do that. 13:18. Behold, I have prepared my case. I know that I shall be in the right. Yeah, unless God asks him, okay, yeah, and so since then, what have you been doing? No. Yeah, Job, that was 6 months ago. What about now? So 16, 17, similar. We read 23. So we don't need to read the rest of those. They're all in the same type of vein, where Job has asserted his innocence, but the context of that innocence has kind of changed as time has gone on. And Elihu is right to say, you have said, Job, that you are in the right, not God. And once you say it, you can't take it back, right? You have to repent. And you can't just say I didn't mean it, or it was a joke, or you misunderstood me. You have slandered God in public. Publicly, you need to fix that. So it's 8:00. I thought maybe we'd get through this whole chapter, but apparently we won't. So we'll take up starting verse 7 next week. I would encourage you to read this chapter a couple of times, and then also read chapter 28. I'll just tell you about, there's always, you go to one chapter and there's always two ways people look at it, right? So chapter 28, who's the author? Now we know God's the author, the Holy Spirit's the author, but who's speaking? That's really the question. Because as we see at the beginning of chapter 7, it starts, and then Job took up his discourse again. And so we see Job is identified there as the speaker, and it's a new discourse. The transition between chapter 27 and 28, there is no such thing. It looks like maybe a continuation of chapter 27. But then as you read it, you see that it is a self-contained unit. It is a praise or something glorifying wisdom. And so the two main arguments looking at it are, this is Job. He's moving from telling people how God's going to deal with the wicked to a praise of wisdom. And the other view is, this is the narrator. The narrator is coming in at a key point in the book after Job has just said this very unwise thing, and he's coming in and talking about wisdom, which is the central theme of the book. Job is a part of the wisdom literature, which is teaching people how to be wise before God. That is, how do they live in the fear of the Lord. And so this chapter in the middle, on that second view, is the narrator, who we've already heard from several times, coming in and saying, maybe you forgot, this isn't really about Job's integrity. This is about where to find wisdom so that we can live rightly before God. And that's the view that I take, that I think is the majority view, that this is the words of the narrator, chapter 28. That's a key chapter in the book. So anyway, so I'd encourage you to read chapter 27 and 28 a couple of times this week. think about the change between the two chapters. Make up your own mind if you think it's the words of Job or perhaps the narrator. But because I think next week we'll finish with this chapter and then move into chapter 28. So, all right. Anybody have anything you want to add before we turn off the recording?
No.
Okay.
No.
All right.